The bell above the pawn shop door made a thin, tired sound as Johnny Cash pushed it open. Memphis heat followed him inside, August 1955, suffocating and relentless. The shop smelled like desperation and old cigarettes, like every broken promise that had ever walked through that door, carrying something precious and leaving with cash that would never be enough. Johnny was 23 years old, married with a baby daughter, selling appliances door to door for commissions that barely covered rent. His pockets held exactly $4.37. The rent was due in 3 days. He owed $75. The math was simple and devastating. He needed money. And the only thing he owned worth selling was the guitar case he carried. Inside that case was a Gibson acoustic his grandmother had given him when he was 12. Not expensive, not vintage, just a working-class instrument that had survived cotton fields and Air Force barracks and 1,000 nights of writing songs nobody had heard. The guitar had 3 small cigarette burns on the body from late nights when Johnny forgot he'd left one burning. The neck was worn smooth where his fingers had pressed the same chords over and over, teaching himself to play because lessons cost money his family would never have. This guitar had been there when he wrote his first song. It had been there during his mother's funeral, the only way he knew how to process grief. It had crossed the ocean with him during his military service, hidden in his footlocker because regulations said he couldn't bring personal instruments, but Johnny couldn't imagine existing without it. And now, on a Thursday afternoon in a Memphis pawn shop, he was going to sell it because being a dreamer didn't pay rent, and his wife Vivian was tired of his promises that music would eventually matter. The pawnbroker was a man named Lou Rosen, 60-something, with reading glasses on a chain and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who'd heard every sob story twice. He looked up from his newspaper as Johnny approached the counter, assessed him in a glance. Young, desperate, probably military by the haircut, definitely broke by the worn shoes, and returned his attention to the sports section.
"What you got?"
Lou asked without looking up. Johnny set the guitar case on the counter. The latches made a clicking sound that felt too loud in the quiet shop. He opened it slowly, like a man opening a coffin, revealing the Gibson inside. Sunlight from the window caught the wood grain, made the instrument look almost holy despite its scars. Lou finally looked up. He studied the guitar for maybe 5 seconds, then returned to his newspaper. $20. The number hit Johnny like a physical blow. $20. For the instrument that had been his companion through every meaningful moment of the last 11 years. $20 wouldn't even cover half the rent. "It's worth more than that," Johnny said, hating how his voice sounded. Pleading. Young. Exactly like every other desperate person who walked through that door. "To you, maybe," Lou said. "To me, it's a used guitar with burns on it. $20. Take it or leave it." Johnny's hand moved to close the case, but stopped. He stared at the guitar, at the familiar curves and worn frets. He thought about Vivian at home with their daughter Roseanne, thought about the eviction notice that would come if he didn't pay rent, thought about his father's voice saying music was a hobby, not a living, and maybe it was time to grow up and get serious about providing for his family. "I need more," Johnny said quietly. "I need at least 40. Lou sighed, the sound of a man who'd had this conversation 10,000 times. "Son, I don't pay based on what you need. I pay based on what I can sell it for. And that guitar? Maybe I can get $35, $40 if I find the right buyer, which means I can give you 20 and hope I don't end up losing money. That's business." Johnny stood there, caught between mathematics and meaning. $20 wasn't enough, but it was something. And something was more than the nothing he'd have if he walked out of here still carrying this guitar and still owing $75 he had no way to pay. "Can I play it?" Johnny asked suddenly. "One last time. Before you take it." Lou looked at him for a long moment, and something in the old man's expression shifted. Maybe he saw something familiar in Johnny's face. Maybe he'd stood on the other side of this counter once, young and broke and deciding what pieces of himself he could afford to sell. Whatever he saw, he nodded. "Yeah, go ahead." Johnny lifted the guitar from its case. The weight of it was familiar, perfect, the way it had always been. He didn't sit down. He just stood there at the counter and started playing. Not a song anyone would recognize. just something he'd been working on, fragments of melody and half-written verses about trains and loneliness and the ache of wanting something the world kept saying you couldn't have. His voice was rough, unpracticed for performance, but honest in the way that mattered. He sang about walking the line between who you were and who you needed to be to survive. The words weren't polished yet, the melody still finding itself, but there was something real in it. Something that came from sleeping on friends' couches and selling appliances to people who couldn't afford them, and loving a woman who deserved better than a husband who couldn't let go of impossible dreams. Lou stopped reading his newspaper. He set it down and just listened, his skeptical expression gradually shifting into something else. Recognition, maybe, or memory of what it felt like to believe in something despite all evidence suggesting you shouldn't. When Johnny finished, the shop was quiet except for the tick of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of Memphis traffic. He lowered the guitar, ready to put it back in the case and take the $20 and figure out how to make peace with what he was about to lose. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" Lou asked. "Taught myself," Johnny said. "My grandmother gave me this guitar when I was a kid. She died a few years back. This is the only thing I have left of her." That was only partially true. What Johnny really had left of his grandmother was the belief she'd planted in him that he was meant for something beyond cotton fields and poverty. She'd been the one who told him his voice mattered, that the songs he wrote in his head were worth writing down, that being poor didn't mean being powerless. The guitar was just the physical representation of that belief. But saying all that to a pawnbroker felt too raw, too much like bleeding in front of a stranger. Lou was quiet, studying Johnny with an intensity that made the young man uncomfortable. Then the pawnbroker did something unexpected. He reached under the counter and pulled out a battered old mandolin, the finish worn off in places, the wood dark with age and handling. "I played this for 30 years, Lou said, running his fingers over the strings without pressing them down, just making them whisper. "Started when I was younger than you. Had dreams about making music, maybe playing on the radio, being somebody beyond this neighborhood. Life had other plans. The bills piled up. The music got quieter, and one day I put this under the counter and started buying other people's dreams instead of chasing my own." He set the mandolin down gently, treating it like it was made of something more fragile than wood and wire. "You know what I regret most? Not that I stopped playing. That was probably inevitable. But that I stopped too easy. First time things got hard, I folded. Told myself it was practical, responsible, grown up. But really I was just scared. Scared I wasn't good enough. Scared I'd try and fail and have to face that I was ordinary." Lou looked at Johnny directly now, and there was something fierce in his eyes beneath the resignation. "You walk out of here with $20, you'll pay some of your rent. You'll still be short. You'll still be broke next month and the month after that. But more than that, you'll have proven to yourself that your music isn't worth fighting for. That the first time things get hard, you fold. And that kind of defeat? Son, that sticks with you. That shapes who you become." Johnny felt something breaking open in his chest, some kind of pressure he'd been carrying without naming it. Lou was right. This wasn't really about the guitar. It was about whether Johnny believed in himself enough to keep going when every practical indicator said to quit. "I can't pay my rent," Johnny said, and his voice cracked on the admission. "I've got a wife and a baby. I'm supposed to be taking care of them, and I can't even keep a roof over their heads. What kind of man does that make me?" "The kind who's figuring out what matters," Lou said. "Look, I don't know if you're any good. I don't know if you'll ever make a dime from music. But I know that guitar means something to you beyond what it's worth in dollars. And I know that 20 years from now, you're either going to look back and be grateful you didn't give up, or you're going to look back and wonder what would have happened if you'd held on a little longer." The two men stood in silence, the Memphis afternoon pressing against the windows, the world outside continuing its indifferent rotation, while Johnny Cash made a decision that would define the rest of his life. "I can't take your $20, Johnny said finally, his hands trembling as he placed the guitar back in its case. "I appreciate you hearing me out, but I can't sell this. I don't know how I'm going to pay rent, but I know I can't walk out of here without this guitar." Lou nodded, something like approval in his expression. "You're either very brave or very stupid. Time will tell which. Probably both," Johnny said, managing a weak smile. He closed the case, the latches clicking with a finality that felt different now. Not like closing a coffin, like closing a chapter that almost happened but didn't. As Johnny turned to leave, Lou called out, "Hey kid, you ever get anywhere with that music, you remember where you almost gave up? You remember this moment, because the world's full of people with talent. What separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't isn't usually the talent. It's the refusal to quit when quitting makes sense." Johnny nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and walked out into the Memphis heat carrying the guitar he'd almost sold. The bell above the door made that same thin sound, but it registered differently now. Not tired, more like a starting bell. He walked the 6 blocks back to the small apartment he shared with Vivian, his mind racing through impossible mathematics. He still owed $75. He still had $4.37. Nothing about his material situation had changed, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. Vivian was feeding Roseanne when he walked in. She looked up, saw the guitar case, and her expression went through several emotions quickly. Confusion, then understanding, then something harder to read. "You didn't sell it," she said. "Not a question." "I couldn't," Johnny admitted. "Viv, I know that doesn't make sense. I know we need the money, but I can't explain it. You're an idiot," Vivian said, but there wasn't as much anger in it as he'd expected. "You know that, right? We're 3 days from eviction, and you walked out of a pawn shop with the one thing worth selling because of some principle." "I know. You're going to have to figure something out." "I can't keep living like this, Johnny. I can't keep wondering if we'll make rent, if we'll eat. Roseanne deserves better." "I know," he said again. "I'll figure it out. I'll pick up extra shifts. I'll do whatever it takes. But I need you to know, the music isn't a distraction. It's not a hobby I need to outgrow. It's the only thing I know how to do that feels true." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, rocking Roseanne gently. Then she said, "You've got 2 weeks. 2 weeks to figure out how to make this work. Not just pay this month's rent, but actually have a plan. Because I love you, but I can't sacrifice our daughter's stability for your dreams indefinitely." It was more grace than he deserved, and they both knew it. Johnny nodded, set the guitar case down carefully, and went to the kitchen to figure out what food they had left and how far he could stretch it. That night, after Vivian and Roseanne were asleep, Johnny sat on the small balcony of their apartment with the Gibson across his lap. He played quietly, working through the song he'd started earlier, the one about walking the line. The melody was coming together now, finding its shape. The lyrics were getting clearer, more honest about the tension between love and ambition, between responsibility and calling. He played until his fingers hurt, until the Memphis night started shifting toward dawn, until the song felt complete enough to be more than fragments. And somewhere in those hours, Johnny made a decision. He was going to call Sam Phillips at Sun Records. He was going to ask for an audition. He'd been too scared before, too convinced he wasn't ready, but the conversation with Lou had shaken something loose. Refusing to sell the guitar was only meaningful if he actually used it for something that mattered. 2 days later, Johnny walked into Sun Records with his guitar and a carefully rehearsed speech about why Sam Phillips should give him a chance. The receptionist looked skeptical. This happened a dozen times a week, young men with guitars and dreams, but she agreed to see if Mr. Phillips had a few minutes. Sam Phillips came out of the studio looking tired and skeptical, the expression of a man who'd heard 1,000 auditions and been disappointed by 999 of them. "You got 5 minutes, he said. "Impress me." Johnny didn't tell him about the pawn shop, didn't explain about the rent or the wife or the decision he'd made in Lou Rosen's shop 3 days earlier. He just opened his guitar case, pulled out the Gibson with the 3 cigarette burns, and started playing Cry, 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 a song he'd written about heartbreak and loneliness and the way pain could be transformed into something people might want to listen to. 5 minutes turned into 15. Sam Phillips sat down, really listening, and when Johnny finished, the producer was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "That's different. That's real. Can you do that again?" 6 weeks later, Cry, Cry, Cry was recorded. 3 months after that, it was on the radio. 6 months after Johnny almost sold his guitar, he was a professional recording artist with a contract and royalty checks that would actually cover rent with money left over. The success didn't happen overnight exactly. There were still hard months, still struggles, still moments when quitting would have been easier. But Johnny carried the memory of Lou's pawn shop like a talisman. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever the pressure mounted, he'd remember standing at that counter with his grandmother's guitar and deciding that some things couldn't be measured in dollars. Years later, when Johnny Cash was famous, when "I Walk the Line" and "Ring of Fire" had made him a household name, he got a letter from Lou Rosen. The old pawnbroker had seen Johnny on television, recognized him immediately, and wanted to say congratulations. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he'd started playing his mandolin again. Not professionally, just for himself, but playing nonetheless. Johnny wrote back immediately. He thanked Lou for the conversation that had changed his life, for seeing him as more than just another broke kid trying to sell something precious. And he told Lou that the Gibson guitar, the one he'd almost sold for $20, was now in a display case in his home studio. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that the value of something isn't determined by what someone will pay for it, but by what you're willing to refuse. The guitar never made it back to a pawn shop. It survived the addiction years, the divorces, the concerts in prisons and stadiums, the decades of travel and transformation. Johnny would sometimes take it down and play it, especially when he needed to remember who he'd been before the fame and mythology. The cigarette burns were still there. The worn frets were still smooth from 1,000 repetitions of the same chords. And every time he held it, he thought about Lou Rosen and the afternoon in Memphis when he'd almost given up. That guitar became more than an instrument. It became evidence of a choice, proof that Johnny had stood at a crossroads and chosen the harder path. And that choice, made in a pawn shop on a desperate afternoon, had made all the difference. Not because the guitar was magical or special, but because refusing to sell it meant refusing to accept defeat. It meant believing, despite all practical evidence, that his music mattered, that he mattered, that the dreams were worth protecting even when protecting them made no financial sense. The world is full of talented people who quit the first time things get hard. Full of guitars and pawn shops, instruments that once meant everything to someone before circumstances forced a choice between dreams and survival. Johnny had been minutes away from becoming one of those stories, another person who'd tried and failed and given up and moved on. The only thing that saved him was an old pawnbroker who recognized something familiar in a desperate young man's eyes and decided to tell the truth instead of making $20. Lou Rosen died in 1972. Johnny went to the funeral, stood in the back of a small Memphis chapel, and afterward approached Lou's widow. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a check for $20,000, exactly 1,000 times what Lou could have made if Johnny had sold that guitar. The note with it said simply, "For the investment he made in a stranger's future. With gratitude, Johnny Cash." The story of the guitar he couldn't sell became part of Johnny's personal mythology, something he'd tell in interviews when people asked about his early struggles. But he never quite captured the full emotional weight of that moment, standing at Lou Rosen's counter, holding his grandmother's guitar, feeling the pull between practical necessity and impossible hope. That moment existed in a space language couldn't quite reach, in the gap between who he was and who he'd have become if he'd made a different choice. Every person who pursues something creative, something impractical, something the world doesn't immediately value, eventually faces their own version of that pawn shop. The moment when quitting makes sense, when the responsible choice is to sell the dream and focus on survival. Some people walk out with money and regret. Some people walk out with their instruments and impossible determination. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that impossible determination turns into something that matters. Not always. Not guaranteed. But sometimes. Johnny Cash walked into Lou Rosen's pawn shop as a broke appliance salesman with a guitar and a dream. He walked out as the same broke salesman, still owing rent, still desperate, but carrying something more valuable than $20. He carried the knowledge that he'd chosen himself, chosen his music, chosen hope over capitulation. And that choice, made in a dusty Memphis pawn shop on an August afternoon, became the foundation of everything that followed.